right, there we go. Well, welcome, Alistair Stewart. I don't know if I should call you professor, doctor.
Not professor. Never had one yet. Never yet.
Well, welcome to the podcast, Restitutio. Thanks for joining me today. You are an expert on early church history, especially on liturgy and polity. Could you talk a little bit about yourself and just introduce yourself a little bit to the audience and let them know who you are?
Yes. Well, as you already know, my name is Alistair Stewart. I have a reputation for expertise in early Christian studies with a particular focus on liturgy and polity. I'm speaking to you from the library of Covington College in Barbados. I first came to Covington as a very young priest and scholar back in the 90s, and I was lured away, long story, after a few years and went north. But my career up north in New York very, very rapidly went west, and so I went east, back to the UK, so where I was a parish priest for 20 odd years in 2 parishes.
And that's within the Church of England?
The Church of England. And just in the last week, I've finally managed to return to Covington, where I intend, with the grace of God, to live out the rest of my days. So I've come back here to teach early Christian studies with a particular focus on the New Testament, which was what I was doing 30 odd years ago. Before I came to Covington, back in the 90s, I'd been ordained a few years in England and done a couple of curacies. So, and it was in the process of my seminary education that what had always been an interest, and again, we'll go back to my kind of teenage years, which most of us blush to think of, and I blush to think of them in many ways. But although I'd not come from a particularly devout family, it was kind of Christmas, maybe, and that was it. And occasional trips to Anglican churches with Cub Scouts, and a brief encounter with a Sunday school. I tell people I was drummed out at the age of 8. But, and really through kind of relationships became kind of interested in religion and Christianity, and joined a very liberal free church when I was 15, 16. And but the turning point then was, as an undergraduate, was all kinds of issues going on. It was leaving school, going to university was a bigger cultural shock for me than for many. I don't know why it was, but it was. I think it was a sudden step up. Partly because I'd coasted through school without ever having done a stroke of work. I think that was possibly part of it. So, coasted through kind of standard school curriculum. And actually starting an undergraduate degree in classics, it was, as I said, I'd never done a stroke of work in my life. So there was that, the whole kind of, hormonal thing, the kind of, your late teens, the whole kind of, life crisis. Is this it? What am I going to do next?
Yeah.
Somebody had the great idea that during the first long vac, I should actually go away, and suggested a WCC activity, World Council of Churches, taking place in Egypt during kind of its voluntary work. And so that was the turning point, really. That was because at the same time as kind of facing down the crisis and finding that this kind of version of Christianity, which I'd kind of encountered, was really, at that point was appearing entirely vacuous and intellectually and emotionally inadequate. And so it was in that context that I kind of first encountered a form of Christianity, as it were, with a conscious link to the historic past. in Egyptian Coptic Orthodoxy. I didn't become a Copt, but as a result of that, I went back to kind of try and decide where I wanted to be on the spectrum of Christian churches, as it were, as a Christian believer in a communion or a church which consciously linked itself to this history that I'd picked up in Egypt, the whole kind of fallout of the Hasidim, but also the kind of Christology of Cyril, the witness of Athanasios, all of this, this was great stuff. It's all new to me. And, once again, I can look back now and say it's a fairly naive reading, but it was exciting, it was adventurous, and it was engaging, and it did have some intellectual substance. So it was a kind of couple of years then of kind of going from church to church, actually, and really becoming drawn more and more to Anglicanism because I think because of, and it's both Anglican, the Anglican weakness and the Anglican strength, is its ability to live with uncertainty and the degree of intellectual honesty that involves. To an extent, also relationships. That it's, for instance, I remember a very dear priest, a Roman Catholic chaplain at university, talking to him because I could have become a Roman Catholic, and I remember him coming talking about Charles. He says, I remember that. Peter has spoken for a year. He said, that's the one thing you could remember about Chalcedon, which of course the one thing that seemed to me most dubious about the whole Chalcedonian episode was this kind of Petrine supremacy. Another of his comments was about the reservation sacrament. He says, of course, the whole Holy Trinity is in there. And I thought, well, not really, no. Whatever your sacramental theology, because the Father isn't somehow in the form of bread. So, whereas the Anglicans seem to be able to kind of talk more civilly, on matters like this. So I gradually kind of, became an Anglican. I'm probably not the most typical Anglican, or certainly not the most typical English Anglican, but I found a niche and I found a place. So after graduation, I did a little bit of work, and then was, felt almost the obligation to offer myself for the priesthood. And so in a fairly short order, when I was in seminary, and that's of course, so I've been interested in this historic Christianity. Yeah. Obviously, being classics already, which meant I didn't have to do New Testament Greek for the first year, which meant in turn that I was able to go straight into Hebrew and Old Testament. Yeah. Which was the first interest. But it was there then that had some great teachers, and Ian Torrance was one, David Parker. These are known names at the time, kind of young junior scholars. But the grandmother of them all, who was already an established scholar, was Sir Francis Young. So it obviously picked up at some point that I had more than a passing interest in early Christian history, even though I was beginning to sort of get more and more interested in New Testament and indeed, through the Hebrew Old Testament. But in order to complete the theology degree at Birmingham University, which I was doing concurrently with my seminary training, that's how it works in England. So you're in a seminary to live, to pray, to kind of do stuff, and go to churches and preach and use clubs and things like that in your spare time. And at the same time, you're simultaneously enrolled in a degree program in a nearby university. So I was enrolled at Birmingham University and doing seminary stuff. In order to complete the degree, we had to kind of complete a kind of long essay or short dissertation, 12,000 words or so. And so I'd been very intrigued by Perry Pascal Melito, very intrigued during one of the seminars at Birmingham. So I thought, well, that could be a good kind of topic for this long essay. And so I did it, and Francis Young, I guess she probably still is It's a bit like the Cheshire Cat. She kind of comes in and out of view. She's very, very hands-off as a supervisor. So she was very, very hands-off with this, you see. So she, oh, yes, yes, yes. So I sort of reminded her around Christmas, oh, yes, yes, yes. So I'm off on sabbatical, but I'm sure it'll be fine. Yes, 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 yes. But, I'll have a look at it Easter. So best part of the year had gone by, and finally she gets down to reading this thing that I kind of more or less knocked out. And that was kind of the other turning point scholarly, because she said, so she had a read of it, and she said, she said, I don't think I'm going to take this. So I thought, well, it's surely not that bad. It was quite good. I'd done all right in all the other patristic papers, and something like my Greek paper, and I picked up Syriac by this point, so I was able to show off a bit of Syriac by referring to the Syriac version, and surely not that bad. Oh, no, she says, it's fine, it's fine. She said, I feel it's probably just a bit too good for this first degree, so what I'm going to do is to put you forward for an MPhil without a first degree. Regulations allow us to do this, so that's what I'm going to do. So I said, well, fine. I said, I'm going to be ordained in about a month's time. Go to the parish. Oh, I'll sort all that out. Who's the bishop? I said, what about the money? Oh, don't worry about that.
Wow.
We'll find the money. And sure enough, this kind of check came from some strange trust somewhere in Birmingham to cover the year's fees for this MPhil that had got. What Frances did was extraordinary, really. She found the money, she sweet-talked the bishop, and she also kind of managed to get this thing through all kinds of university regulations. And we actually go an MPhil in theology, never having actually completed a first degree in theology.
Huh.
So
that's fascinating.
Yeah, that's Francis. That's Francis' amazing person.
So let me just back up for a second and talk about your languages. You really came on my radar a couple months ago. I was working on a lecture on early church orders.
Right.
So naturally, I got this handsome little volume, Apostolic Tradition, Hippolytus, and you were the translator on this. And then I got a copy of the Didascalia Apostolorum, and you were the translator on that. And then I got this little guy too. The Apostolic Church Order with the Greek text on one side. And I was just thinking to myself, okay, these three books are from three different languages, right? The Didascalia is Syriac. I'm assuming that Hippolytus is Latin, and is that Greek or Latin? Hippolytus.
Hippolytus is not a text. It's a reconstruction. So in fact, the main version, where it's extant, the best version is the Latin.
Yeah.
The Greek is completely, but there's a new Ethiopic version that's also very, very important, very fundamental.
Right.
And there's a version in Coptic, Syriac Coptic. There's and then there's the rewritings, which are quite important for reconstructing it. So the text really has to be reconstructed, which is why when it's got a line of text followed by notes on text and translation.
Yeah.
I'm trying really just to show my hand as to why that is the text that I chose. I may be wrong, but I want show say that mathematics.
Well, I certainly appreciate that.
Workings, so that the reader can actually see my workings and choose to disagree and give the other options and the different versions.
So I saw that these were all by the same author. Yes. And I thought, who is this Alistair Stewart? Who is this guy? And you have different publishers for each one. And then Erdman sent me this new book, which we'll get to in a little while here. And I was like, wow, this Stewart, he really produces. He really gets it done over the years. And so I want to probe a little bit before you go on to talk about the PhD. I want to probe a little bit into your language learning, because you studied the classics at the University of St. Andrews. You learned Latin and Greek there, right? What was that experience like for you? Was it grueling? Was it just easy to pick up, or
It was horrible, but it was St Andrews. I didn't like St Andrews. I didn't flourish there as a person. It's too very cold St Andrews. And I mean, the thing is, socially it was difficult. St Andrews is really two kind of parts that these may have changed now. There are two parts of the student body. Very posh English students and kind of ordinary, working class, lower middle class Scottish students. As a definitely lower middle class English student, as it were, I kind of could fit comfortably into neither kind of group. The degree was fine, mostly. The language learning is boot camp, isn't it? You just got to kind of get on and do it. And it's not easy. As I say, I didn't enjoy it, and I say really when I got, as I say, what had happened is in the meantime I got much more interested in patristics and theology than in the classics I was meant to be doing.
Yeah.
And I'm also have other interests besides most of which have fallen by the way now. But I was an active student politician, rather like the former Prime Minister of the UK, who also read classics. But so on the other side, I have to say, in terms of a left-leaning, kind of endless happy hours going to Scottish and National, Union, Labour. So I was very, very active in student politics. That took time and energy and attention. I was far more interested in patristics by this point than I actually was in classics. But those were the days when once you embarked on a degree, you couldn't get off it. I think it's all changed now. I think now, had the regulations been different, I would probably jump ship at some point and gone straight to theology. But I just didn't have that option.
Yeah.
I was locked into another 2 years of classics regardless.
Yeah. Well, classics is not a terrible place to start for patristics because, they're a lot of times imitating their style of writing.
As I found out later, the classics I left Andrews, and that was it, until I went to seminary. It's only, not even at the PhD, really only when I was doing the doctorate, and even subsequently that I actually began to realise the utility of what I'd done all those years previously at St Andrews. But also the curriculum, the stuff that I find particularly interesting in the classics. Social history is, I think, is a massively important thing. Rhetorical construction, I think, is pretty major. And that maybe now, but certainly then didn't form any significant part of a classics degree.
Yeah. It
was lots of Homer, lots of Virgil, bit of Horace, what else have we? Ammianus Marcellinus, obscure epigraphy from 5th century Athens to try and figure out. Yeah. Just about. I can just remember the name of Solon. I think that's all I can tell you about him. So it was, as I say, it was a grueling and difficult one. But as I say, the advantage came when I went to seminary because I was exempted from Greek. Which meant
that freed you up to study Hebrew.
And that in turn freed me up to start Syriac. Because, where others were then going on to do Hebrew and then start doing a bit of Hebrew in second year, I'd done it my first year. What do I do with this spare year? Or let me do, Syriac looks interesting to go at that. And found that was pretty okay. But other things I picked up much more slowly and less well. I think the thing with languages, actually, I keep forgetting them. I have to relearn them every time.
That's the problem with language, isn't it? You forget over time. Use it or lose it.
Latin and Greek are kind of hardwired. But the others, I just have to, what happens every time you relearn it, it comes back more quickly.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's fun. The great, I mean, one of the great fun things about church orders, and I mean, there's a few examples on the blog, is that they were written in Greek by and large, and have by and large perished. So, you know, you mentioned Didascalia and Syriac. Well, it's in Syriac because it's a translation of the Greek, and it's the only translation to have survived, apart from some very large fragments in Latin. And it's always great fun and very, very interesting then when the Latin says one thing and the Greek says another, and the Syriac says something else. Mm-hmm. So then it's the exciting thing you get to do is to actually try to retrovert both into Greek to try and find out who made the error and what the error was. And then in Apostolic Church Order, it's a Greek text that has survived, but in many places it's so garbled as to be incomprehensible in a single medieval manuscript. Written by a monk who was probably drunk at the time, and of a very poor copy. And so, you know, again, you have to, it's kind of comparing the Latin, the Greek, the Syriac.
You've done so much of this source criticism, haven't you?
That's it. And it's great now, line them up and see if you can actually figure out what the original actually said. So that's you know, a bit of evening's entertainment when, you know, really, really bored.
Some people do crossword puzzles. You compare recensions of church orders.
That's it. Start the day with a crossword and end the day with you didn't mention the canons of Hippolytus. That's my other one on church orders.
Oh, which one is that?
The canons of Hippolytus. That's my most recent.
Yeah.
From the same Australian publisher. It's not well known. I think the publisher was fed up with me. Well, for some, I don't know. I mean, publishers probably somewhere, you know, with lawyers and librarians in the outer circles of hell. But
yeah. We won't tell them you said that.
No. I've said it publicly. You know, in the last, they say, you know, kind of misquoting Robespierre, looking forward to the day when the last publisher is trying to
go with the entrails of the last librarian. Oh man.
Basically, I got fed up with them because they've been sitting on this run. It seemed like 2 years, and they said, "Oh, you know, what's left to do? What rubbish a bloody thing." And then I was in conversation with another publisher about something else altogether, and I said. And I said, you know, I got these two texts, they're finished, they're ready, they're waiting. Oh, we'll have them, they said. So I went back to, you know, the Australian publisher and I said, you know, look, I've got an offer to publish them in 3 months' time from Repulse. Why don't I just take them there? So at which point they published them almost instantly.
Uh-huh.
2 weeks later, they pressed whatever button they had to press and they came out. But I don't think they sent any review copies out.
I see it here on Amazon. The Canons of Hippolytus, an English version with introduction and annotation, and an accompanying. Does it say Arabic?
Yeah.
Arabic text. So do you do Arabic as well?
Well, I forgot most of it, but I did spend 2 years in a Quranic school in Hounslow.
Unbelievable. So Hebrew, Syriac, and Arabic.
Yeah, a bit of Coptic here and there.
And Coptic, right.
Bits and bits.
Is Coptic at all similar to those other ones, to Arabic? Because I think it's more of an isn't that just an Egyptian language written in Greek letters?
It is, yes. Arabic and Ethiopic are the two closest, I think, very close to each other. Got some similar peculiarities, things like woken plurals and quadrilateral roots. Yes, so I spent 2 years studying Arabic, and I say in an Islamic Quranic school in Hounslow.
And when was that?
That was while I was in Slough, so about 2015.
Oh, so that was more recently.
Yes, yeah. I tried to keep try and keep it going.
So would you get bored that year? You're like, you know what? I'm going to go join a Quranic school.
It was. I really, really, really wanted to study the canons of Hippolytus in depth. And I mean, it was as simple as that. I really, really wanted to do an in-depth study of the canons of Hippolytus. It was the only church order I hadn't really kind of done properly. And the only extant text is Arabic,
Yeah.
which is a translation from the Coptic, which in turn had been translated from the Greek. So again, it's
Oh my goodness.
great, wonderful fun of, what the hell does this piece of Arabic mean? It's a Copticism. But what does that mean? It's a Grasticism. Now we know what it means.
Idioms upon idioms.
It's great stuff. But I'm very excited about my canons and pontiffs thing, not just
Yeah, I'll have to take a look at that one.
not just when I finally did it, but because, and this is why I'm so vexed that they haven't sent review copies out, because I proposed a very, very, very radical provenance and dating for it, completely different from the standard line. The standard line is in the 4th century, actually. The dating is more or less the same, but it's everyone just universally considered to be Egyptian. And I'm absolutely sure it's Cappadocian. I'm absolutely sure it's Cappadocian. And I'm absolutely sure it's contemporary with Basil, and therefore contemporary with the Testamentum Domini, which I've rendered out as a Syriac version for St. Vladimir's again, and pretty well contemporary and almost in the same place as Apostolic Church Order. So what that's saying to me is that there was a version of Apostolic Tradition circulating in the 4th century Cappadocia in the middle of the 4th century, and that they're all drawing on that. And there's all kinds of stuff that, to my mind, becomes very, very clear once you assign a Cappadocian provenance to the Testamentum Domini. So the Testamentum Domini, which I already did, but in that case I wasn't the first. James Cooper had done it back in the early 20th century.
Okay.
I revived that. Grant White, similarly. So you can always say it's a forming consensus on Testamentum Domini. But if you think canons of Hippolytus is coming from the same provenance and around the same time, this is really extraordinarily important. For instance, I'll give you one example, and this is something I'm rabbiting on about a lot, and I'm going to be boring the students at Brompton College with when I start teaching in the new year, new academic year. I've just moved, just been a couple of days back here, which is the whole thing about the synexis. So in Eastern baptismal rites, you say something like, I believe and I trust in the Father and in the Son and the Holy Spirit. And that's the confession of faith, that's called the syntaxis. So first of all, I reject the devil and all his works.
Right.
And put my faith and trust in God the Father and in the Son and in the Holy Spirit. Or in other versions, the Christological version, I put my faith in Jesus Christ, and we as Western Christians might add, as Saviour and Lord. And then go down to the water and then be baptized. Now, the baptismal rite of the canons of Hippolytus has one of these syntaxes. If it's Egyptian, that means, therefore, that there's a similar syntaxis in the Egyptian rite. But the other ancient Egyptian rite that's relatively recently been discovered and published by Brackman does not have a syntaxis. And it makes a lot of sense not having a syntaxis, because there is a profession of faith in the Egyptian rite, a completely separate one. A fivefold confession of God the Creator, based on the rule of faith, really, of God the Creator, of Jesus Christ, born and raised, and in the Holy Spirit, and in the Holy Church, and in the resurrection. That's the traditional Egyptian creed. It doesn't need a syntaxis. So this is what I'm interested and excited at the moment, is that if you accept the canons of Hippolytus is not Egyptian, then that explains that it says to me that syntaxis is a purely Cappadocian and Syrian ritual. So in the West, where we have an interrogation, do you believe in God? I believe in the Father, / do you believe in Jesus Christ, / do you believe in the Spirit? That's one legitimate ancient form of baptismal rite. In the East, do you reject Satan? I reject Satan. And what do you believe? And the candidate actually has to say, I believe in the Father and the Son and the Spirit. And then is baptized. and that's an authentic and ancient form of baptismal confession. In Egypt, to have something different, again, it sort of speaks to me of the whole unity of the church, which is hidden behind the various forms, because what they all are professions of faith in Christ and making that real through water. So then in Egypt, what we would have is possibly the rejection, but then in terms of profession of faith, it's repeat the faith, what I believe, and the fivefold creed followed by baptism with a formula, which you don't have in the West until the medieval period. So, I mean, that's a kind of small thing, but just to rescue the canons of apologists from it, say it's actually foundation, I think it has implications. And that's why I'm so kind of baffled, as it were, that I've not seen the review of it anywhere. Even if somebody wants to take issue with it, at least it means a discussion started. It means a debate.
Right. To be ignored is the worst in this case.
It is.
Yeah.
So, I can put that on.
Yeah. Fascinating questions, and there's a lot of interesting Christology in these church orders as well, especially the Didascalia, and we didn't really touch on the apostolic constitutions. Maybe another few years, and you'll give us a new translation of that one as well.
I'm halfway through book 2.
What's that?
I'm halfway through book 2.
Okay.
Yes, it's my kind of wind down project.
Yeah. Well, I think the only translation out is the old one from the A&F series.
Yeah. So I'm working on a translation of that. But it's a long job. It's a huge text.
Well, that one will be a walk in the park for you, right? I mean, that's just
in terms of translation, yeah, pretty straightforward. But it's just I've been very, very busy these last few years, and then getting breaking bread out. I mean, I'm telling people I'm giving up. I'm slowing right down. I mean, translations. I'm going to start doing a few more translations again. I'll keep those going.
Yeah.
I think.
Well, it's important because it gives us access. Where else were we going to find the Apostolic Church Order? Where else were we going to find it? Hippolytus, the Apostolic Tradition. There's a website where some guy translated it himself. Of course, there's Minia. If somebody wants to look at, pictures of Minia online and translate it from the Latin, but then there's the old 1800s. No, it actually wasn't even in there. It wasn't even in the ante-Nicene Fathers, right? So you're doing us a real service to bring these things into English for non-specialists to have exposure. And what I love about the church orders, and we definitely do need to get to this book, but what I love about the church orders is how, and this probably is what appeals to you as well, is how practical they are. It's like, okay, we're going to do this, then we're going to do this, then we're going to do that. And it's, you don't seem to be the kind to delve much into theology.
No, that's right. I always say not a theologian.
Yeah. In fact, which would be a good segue to the Breaking Bread book, because in this book, this is a book about, the subtitle, The Emergence of Eucharist and Agape in Early Christian Communities. Many of us seeing a book on communion within church history or Eucharist within church history, we're going to immediately ask one question. What does he say about transubstantiation? What does he say about real presence? Does he believe that it's symbolic as a memorial? What is he going to say? And it's like you don't have a horse in that race. So you really are drilling down on the practical side of what do they do, what was it like for them, how did it change, and really documenting that. So maybe you could talk a little bit about the book, why this book, Breaking Bread. What are you trying to accomplish here?
When we do my biography, you may remember we got as far as the PhD. So,
Oh, that's right. Yes, we should return to that.
well, this is important because actually what this is the unfinished business from way back then.
Right. Your PhD was called the Quarto Decimian Passover Liturgy at Sardis in light of Melito's Peri Pascha from critically examined or form critically examined.
That's the title, wasn't it? That's right.
Yeah, a real catchy title. I'm surprised it didn't turn into a pop song, you know?
Catchy title like that, yeah. It was published by Boyle in 1998 under the title The Lamb's Eye Feast.
Oh, there we go. Yeah.
And what that was fundamentally about was to suggest that Melito's Peri Pascha, historically said to simply be a sermon, was actually rather more than a sermon, or rather more than what we would think of as a sermon, in that it was the means by which those Christians in Sardis encountered Christ at their Passover. So in other words, you could say it was quasi-Eucharistic, that it was Eucharistic in the sense that they met the risen Lord, they encountered the Lord, and the text accompanied eating. It wasn't, he didn't stand in a pulpit or on a bema and just proclaim this text. This was a text that took place around the table. And I remember I coined a line that somebody else subsequently coined, so they coined it in print before I did. So in the beginning was the meal. So, the old Didascalia, in the beginning was a sermon. In the beginning was the meal. And that was what the Lamb's Eye Feast is basically about. It's reconstructing the Passover rite of these early Christians on the basis of a document, and then, looking at the other supporting evidence to see how it all fitted together, what they did, and how they met Christ in their Paschal liturgy. So, that in turn led on to the next question. You see, if it's not a sermon, if it's not the first sermon, what is the first sermon? What were early sermons like? How did the sermon originate? So I did that in a book which I finished in far too great haste. It was finished too quickly and therefore has a great many faults and errors called Prophecy to Preaching. And what it was, of course, I was in America, I was fighting for professional and financial survival. And
publish or perish.
It really was. It was I thought just get yet another book out. How can they argue? Well, of course, they could argue. They still got rid of me. But in the meantime, the book went out. So, I stand by the fundamental thrust of the argument, which was that preaching originated actually as again around the table in prophetic speech that subsequently has to be examined because, of course, you can't just trust a prophet. And so, what do you do when somebody prophesies? Well, you test the prophecy. You test it against prophecy you already received. Prophecy you already received, of course, is the scriptural prophecy, the sayings of Jesus. So, charismatic exegesis can then come about. So, that was the next bit. Then I left academia and went into parish work and spent 20 years. So, that's how the translation work started, because it was something I could also be doing and editing the text, because, you come at the end of a kind of long, difficult day. You can do half an hour translating.
Yeah.
Translate 200 words, that's fine. But, if you're trying to write a monograph, you spend half an hour trying to remember where you were when you left off writing last.
Yeah.
So
it's almost like translation was therapy for you as a priest.
Yes. And
a way to keep your academic side alive and progressing and not just atrophying.
Absolutely, and hopefully useful for others as well, which people say it is. That's great. So, but the thing is that and various other. I did do another monograph on early bishops that came out during the period in which I was actually on an extended sabbatical in between parishes. So I produced a monograph then. So, but this I started this in 2013 when I went to the parish. I literally just left. Literally, In fact, where I still technically am a parish priest, I'm on 3 weeks terminal leave. So it started almost as soon as I got there. And I read an article by Andrew McGowan, who is a good guy, arguing that the meal in Tertullian's Apologeticum 39 was an evening Eucharist. I think it's, I want to stick to the old kind of line that it's an agape. And then I think around 2012, an entirely independent article came out arguing exactly the same, apparently not having with McGowan. And I thought, well, I can write a short article answering those two, Andrew McGowan and this other guy, this German chap. So it grew out of an article, because you then sort of say, well, okay, if it is an agape and not a Eucharist, well, what's an agape anyway? Now, I kicked around these various ideas right the way through the noughties without getting a great deal written down. In my edition of the Life of Polycarp, there's some very interesting meal rites. And it was then that I kind of came up with the idea that the distinction in agape and Eucharist might be a generic distinction. So in other words, you may have a variety of Eucharistic meals, not a Eucharist and an agape, but a variety of Eucharistic meals and a variety of other meals. So I define Eucharistic meals as being meals intended to either create or to strengthen ties between the believer and the participant and a supernatural being. Defining as broadly as possible.
Right. So it's about union rather than community primarily.
Whereas agape is entirely about community.
Right.
That was my working hypothesis, as it were. And then at France, I got an invitation to write something for Francis Young's Restitutio, which, given how much he'd done for me as a student, was could not possibly refuse. And I had this idea, again, kicking around, about how she had written an essay back in the 70s on early Christology called In the Myth of God Incarnate, called something like
that's where I recognize her from. Yes. Okay, so right. I knew the name, and maybe she has a commentary as well that I've read. Does she? I'm trying to think what book of the Bible.
Meaning and Truth in 2 Corinthians.
Did she do a commentary on Mark?
Don't think she did.
But I do remember her from Myth of God Incarnate. Yeah.
Her essay was called Two Roots or a Tangled Mess, you see. And I thought that was a very nice way to look at the formation of the Eucharist, kind of Lietzmann, classically, two roots of the Eucharist. And I say, not two roots, tangled mess.
Yeah.
So I started to write this one up for her Festschrift. Well, it rapidly became too big. Again, I had bits and fragments on that. I'd done an article, and again, it started because I was working, always interested in Didascalia. And so I'd done little bits on Didascalia on and off, and I had sort of notes and fragments and things on that. So I had all these bits of cloth, as it were, lying around the work, bits of metal, as it were, around of projects that are started but never quite completed, but. And then I sat down to do this thing to respond to Andrew McGowan and that. And at that in then I thought, well, you've got to start really being serious about defining agape and Eucharist. So it kind of just grew out of that and grew out of that. So it was intended originally just to be an article. And then ages and ages and ages ago, I'd done a thing about the formation of the liturgy as a word. And again, looking at it as a table rite. What you do as a Greco-Roman table, one of the things you do is read books. So that's, how liturgy of the word starts, but of course what then happens is, it happens before the Eucharist. That's a pattern we're all familiar with. Any Anglican, Roman Catholic, Orthodox, you go in, there's readings from the Word of God, there may be a sermon, and then you get to the important stuff. So why is it kind of stuck on the beginning? And I suggested then it resulted as a move from evening to morning. So you read at dinner, you read after dinner, you sing songs after dinner. So you sit down at dinner, and you may well even have a slave reading to you while you eat. Then after a symposium, you'll pass the manuscript around, or other people might prophesy, or talks about him in 1 Corinthians 14. But what happens at breakfast? You tend not to read at breakfast. I mean, look at our own breakfast. You should take it on the hoof. You may have the radio on. You probably don't listen to half of what's on the radio. It's just sort of there in the background. It's hurried. You don't have a conversation with your significant other at breakfast much. Morning love, pass the cornflakes. That's a dinner activity.
Yeah.
My thinking was that early Christian catechesis would take place early in the morning. And that, therefore, what happened when the Eucharist was moved to the morning, when it became breakfast, as it were, the reading kind of got stuck before onto the catechesis. And then it's followed by the eating, and then you eat quickly and go. So again, that was another piece that was already hanging around. And then...
and what was your evidence for the timing of the meal?
Well, that's a lot of that in the first chapter, which you probably have the advantage of me, because I don't actually have a copy of the Breaking Bread book.
Okay.
I mean, one notices, that in the earlier sources, the meals are taking place in the evening, they're dinners. So one of the layers of Hippolytus, when evening comes, you bring in the lights. But you don't bring the lights in the morning, do you? You bring them at night.
Right.
And, that's a Eucharistic rite, and it's obviously happening in the evening. Paul is talking about a date from one. He's talking about something happening in the evening. And the Didascalia, when you are satisfied. Again, people you eat in the evening, you eat a satisfying meal in the evening.
Yeah, and this is this big German word.
Different. That's right.
Yeah. I had to look that one up. I was like, okay.
Wonders of German is that you can always make up a word if you're not quite sure. Just stick loads of other words together to make a long one.
Yeah, that's how you finish up your. Let's see if I can pronounce it. Sadie Gung's Schmal. Is that it? You say it so fast. It's incredible. So the idea is that this is a satisfying meal, that fits with dinner. So you're picking up these hints that fit with an evening activity instead of a morning activity. And we know there were also morning meetings, right? From what was it, Pliny the Younger's letter to Trajan?
Yes, absolutely. But what he also says was that they used to meet in the evening, but they'd given it up. Now, maybe they abandoned it altogether, but my thinking was actually that they've been transferred to the morning.
Yeah.
So already in 110, what's happened is, and you see on the Stato Die, they met on a set day, but it clearly never says what it was. And they said, and what you kind of get from this is that they meet in the morning, and they used to meet in the evening. Now, if they were come out of Judaism, you see, they would have met on the second eve of Sabbath, at the end of the Sabbath, the beginning of the first day, the morning, as it were, the evening of the first day. So that, I think, is the Stato Die to which Pliny refers. And that the abandonment isn't so much an abandonment, rather transfer to the following morning. So again, you've got, Paul in Troas in Acts 20. And he talks all night when somebody falls out the window.
Yeah. And ironically, his name is Good Luck, right? Eutyches. It's an ironic name. Falls out of a window and dies.
But the thing is, that's happening on a Saturday night. What Luke tells us. So I'm saying, well, it makes sense then that the gathering is taking place at the end of Sabbath. So you are a Jew and you believe that Jesus is the Messiah. and you believe that Jesus has been raised and he is the chosen one. What do? You do your usual Sabbath activity on Friday evening. On Saturday, you spend your time reading the scriptures, and then, having completed that, you then gather for your meal, but you gather with your fellow Christian Jews to celebrate the meal at which we believe that we're going to now encounter Jesus, our Messiah.
Right.
And
would they consider that Sunday? Because it was after sunset, right?
It's the first day. It's the first day.
Yeah. So it's in a Jewish mind, that would be the first day then.
Exactly. And it's that first
very
day.
Early on the first day, which we would call Saturday night.
Saturday night, precisely.
Yeah. Yes. Okay.
And it's transferred then, comes early Sunday morning. But why? I don't know. I think I canvass in chapter 1. I think I canvass about 8 possible explanations, none of which are completely, few of which are absurd, and none of which completely convince.
Right.
Lots of reasons, not sure why, but it happened, and it happened at a different speed and pace across the empire. The first definite evidence is Plinius, that and that's in the early 2nd century, and they're talking about something that happened some years beforehand. So possibly as early as the 80s or 90s in Bithynia, they've moved the meeting forward to the morning, and what's happened is, it's right, there's always this contrast in the literature between, wasn't it wonderful when the Eucharist was a proper meal and everybody ate to their fill and went away. And all we have now is this little token sip of wine with this little token bit of bread. And my point is actually a small piece of bread is all most people would have had for breakfast.
Yeah.
And you'd have dipped it in wine in some parts, otherwise water, which is why we then have these water Eucharists start appearing in these cheese Eucharists. And, a lot
which
of
would make sense for breakfast as well, yeah.
It's as simple as that. Because constitutive food was always bread. But we have and wine at dinner, but people don't drink wine in the ancient world in the morning any more than we do. Who's in the pub, you go to continental Europe, and the bars are open at 8 in the morning. But the only people actually drinking alcohol are people coming off night shifts.
Yeah.
And that's their evening, as it were. So, there's a few cases of people drinking wine in the morning, but they're usually in the context of saying this person was a drunkard.
Right. There's something wrong here.
There's something wrong. When there's a comedy, I can't remember one of the Plautus comedies, and they carry a bottle of wine for breakfast, you see. And one of them says, well, why are you bringing a bottle of wine? I said, because of course, actually, the bibulous doorkeeper will smell the wine and come out, and then they can sneak in behind her back. So wine is an exception at breakfast, which is why I think we start seeing water and cheese at early morning Eucharists in the 2nd century. And because, of course, there's no connection to the Last Supper.
Right.
That's the other key thing. That the Eucharist is, I believe, an encounter. If you're looking for real presence, I'll sign up for real presence in the historical record, as wide a sense and term one can. It was about meeting Jesus in some way.
Right.
Whether through prophecy. In some cases, hearing the word of prophecy while he went, were they in, the bread? That's there very early. Or it may be in the slightly Calvinistic sounding, the act of eating. But I think what the act of eating does, I think that's Paul. I think what that does is about recreating, renewing the covenant that the believer has with Christ.
Yeah.
Rather than a kind of dynamic receptionism of a Calvinistic or Cranmerian type. Oh, there's a bit of theology.
If you're feeling all right.
But I think, I don't have to theological minds. That's why I tend to avoid it. So I knew enough to understand what people were talking about, but not to actually make an original contribution. But yes, in some sense, all these Eucharistic meals were about, the presence of Christ. And in an ancient Mediterranean setting, of course, that's nothing odd, because you've got all these various meals where you have heroes. They kind of come and eat. They believe that their hero comes and eats. They believe sometimes in participating in the sacrificial animal that they're kind of encountering some kind of communion with the God. So, when a second century Christian in, say, Smyrna says, when I go to this meal, I encounter Christ, my God, the second century pagan to whom he's talking says, okay, yeah, sure. That's perfectly sensible.
Yeah, it doesn't sound weird.
No, it doesn't sound weird or freaky at all.
Well, and there are plenty of comparables, right, with Dionysus or Bacchus.
Yeah. It all fits quite comfortably into a first and second century Mediterranean setting. I say the key thing was, so I say this is how it started with trying to respond to McGowan, and the chapter the article got bigger and bigger and more unwieldy. And then by a happy circumstance, I come back to doing this thing on Sabbath and Sunday, which I touched on in my Polycarp. It was an excuse to have a holiday in Rome. I mean, who wouldn't turn up a holiday in Rome, would you? Or give a paper to conference while you're there. Right. So, I gave this paper on Sabbath and Sunday and Aristo and Pella. And that I come across because it was an invitation. It's funny, everything runs into everything else. I was invited to write an essay for a collection of essays that has yet not been published. God, what they're doing with it. But I wrote this back in 2016, around then, on Paul in Restitutio Sardis. Well, I rapidly came to the conclusion that Paul, Restitutio Sardis didn't really know Paul, may have heard of him, but it was not in the Pauline stream. And in the process, they wondered whether I might do something on Aristo, Pella and Paul. So I said, what about kind of making it even bigger? We could have the Jewish apologists in Paul, because it was a book on apologists in Paul. So I said, chapter on Jewish apologists, I can write about Restitutio, I can write about Aristo, Pella, and I can write about Hegesippus and bring the whole thing into a coherent chapter. So in the process, I came across this fragment of Aristo, Pella, relatively recently published in the Harvard Theological Review, talking about, and it was some Jewish, typical kind of dialogue like the one with Trifo between Jew and Christian. And the Jew says, well, how come you prefer Sunday to Saturday? You see, and that's how. So that kind of, again, linked into this thing about how the Eucharistic meal gets moved to the morning. It was a concatenation of all kinds of good things coming together. And then somehow, in the process of giving that paper and the questions afterwards, I got entangled in a conversation with a number of Roman Catholic priests, including one who turned out to be from Ghana, because I'd sort of I'd sort of assumed he was West Indian, you see, but it turns out to be a real African. But we got involved with a whole long conversation then about the Eucharist, and they hadn't come across the water Eucharist and the cheese Eucharist, you see. And I said, well, I'm not making it up, you know what I mean? And the idea that in some places the cup would come before the bread, which I actually, in my last stage of writing Breaking Bread, I then came to realize was actually more the norm than the exception. So we had a very, very interesting discussion, and that then fed into it. So at this point, I then think, well, hang on, I've got these kind of rambling chapters about breakfast and about Sabbath and Sunday and how the two kind of, I've got all this old work, and I've got all this stuff about the formation of the Eucharistic canon that I originally wrote for Francis. And I've got this new thing that I've now been doing about, why an agape isn't Eucharist and Eucharist is an agape. I wonder if I could actually put the three together to make a book. This is what I'm now thinking, you see, about. And I think it's worth a go at this point, you know what I mean? I think there's probably enough there. I don't think it's going to be a big one, it's going to be a long one, but if I've got three 20,000 word chapters, let's put them together, and then at which point you don't realise what's missing is any discussion of the Last Supper, for instance.
Yeah.
Yes, that'd be good. I can actually write a book about the origins of the Eucharist and not mention 1 Corinthians 11, not mention the Last Supper. Wouldn't that be good and original? But, so
it all came together.
It really was a history. Really, the 10 years. 10 years that I was in Slough. So we'll say the 9 years of everything just came together constantly, and everything just fell together all the time. Everything I did just fed into this one book. And then, of course, most interestingly, COVID and lockdown. And it was a strange and interesting thing to actually find out I was writing a book about the Eucharist whilst the Eucharist is not being celebrated. So it almost, I think, became a substitute for the real thing, because for about 4 or 5 months in England, the churches were completely closed. We weren't even allowed to go into our own churches. And we can look back now and say, should we have just, refused to obey? But the bishops were telling us to obey, so it would have been a double disobedience, as it were. The bishops, not just of government direction, not to kind of invite people in, but just to kind of go in, as it were. I did go in a couple of times just to make sure the place was still standing up, as it were. But,
right.
The roof wasn't leaking and things like that, which I technically wasn't allowed to. But to actually have that period with no Eucharist and having to kind of invent liturgy on the hoof for online delivery. I took the view immediately that just saying Mass and broadcasting it wasn't a way to bring liturgy into people online. One had to do something absolutely, something really genuinely completely different. So I did a lot of kind of extended meditations and lots of music and slideshows and pictures and kind of appropriate art kind of fleshing up. And we'd gather on a Sunday and then we'd have an online chat afterwards and an online sermon. But whatever it wasn't the worship of the church that we've always known.
Yeah.
Good in its own way, but
better than nothing, but not nearly as good as it could be.
It was what I could do, it's what I could do. But I think then kind of sitting down, really kind of hammering away at the book during the lockdown, suddenly, kind of all this kind of time with, no meetings, no travel, not allowed to go out. It just, the last chapter fell in place. And, so yes, it was a very happy coincidence, but I say in the process, it really, I feel, is the end of my scholarly odyssey that started out in the late 80s, reading the letter of Sardis and suggesting it's a real right. And then going through all of other stuff, the translations, the editions of church orders, all of which are essential, all of which feed into the kind of larger project.
Yeah.
And then finally to, as it were, kind of, have my word on the Eucharist. Because, at the time we're talking about the early 90s, to say, the Church's early Eucharist was not related to the Last Supper. They didn't use the word institution. Well, these are pretty radical things to be saying. They're mainstream now. But, when Andrew McGowan at the time, he was working on his doctoral thesis on this very topic at Notre Dame when I was first at Covington, or in Barbados all those years ago. And again, these are the early days of the stream-driven internet. And we used to have these things, you're probably too young to remember them, you say, but they were great. And I wish that they'd come back, of email discussion lists. So it was a listserv. You see something, you can actually write an email to the group. Does anybody know anything about this text? And then it was very simple because it was text only, and therefore didn't use a lot of bandwidth. Because these are the days when you were using speeds of 200-400 kilobytes.
Right. Yeah, I remember those days.
A picture up took an hour to get a picture.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I mean, it was very, very good. And I came across him on one of those kind of email discussion lists. But so I'd been thinking these radical thoughts, but really hadn't kind of done anything in print, but that's what was going through my head. You know, I'm saying this is a Eucharist or a Eucharistic, what I would now say, I wouldn't call it a Eucharist, I'd call it a meal of Eucharistic character.
Right.
The Earth and Pascha. And I revive all of this in Breaking Bread, and I kind of revisit all of this. This is a meal of Eucharistic character. It's unrelated to the Last Supper tradition. It's an annual event, so it's actually also unrelated to what you do on a Sunday, but it's still a meal of Eucharistic character. And these are days when people were, you know, still the standard line was the Last Supper, Jesus founded the Eucharistic. I mean, I don't just mean in churches, I mean in scholarship. People are always looking to see how then, well, what about Jewish roots? Well, we put the words of Restitution into a Jewish prayer, as it were, as an embolism. That was one widely given answer. And to just abandon that search for, you know, completely was a very, very, very radical departure indeed. Mm-hmm. You know, for a young scholar. So I was thinking, you know, quite radical thoughts about Eucharistic development and about liturgical development generally. I remember Francis saying to me, I keep forgetting that actually I'm supervising someone who's more interested in liturgy than anything else, which I was. But 1982 was the other interesting thing that happened in 1982, apart from my completing my doctorate, was that Paul Bradshaw's Search for the Origins of Christian Worship was published. And I mean, in that, and I picked up this book pretty when as soon as it published, and I'm reading it thinking, that's exactly what I've been thinking. Mm-hmm. And dared not say, you know, because it's just too over, it's too kind of wild and wacky. But there's this guy, an established scholar, you know, and he's saying these things, I can't, it's not as wild and wacky as I.
And who was that again?
Bradshaw.
Okay.
So I say, you know, as I say, and his book, as I say, it's the classic. He did a second edition, which I don't think is as good as the first, actually. Often the way with second editions, isn't it? You think it's better, but nobody else does. But, I mean, it was updated, but I didn't think it was, I mean, it really was a foundational and quite amazing work, you know, as I say, at the time, it really did shake up the whole liturgical kind of establishment. Yeah, 30 years now. Blimey.
Well, we got to draw our conversation to a close here, and maybe you could just talk a little bit about the pastoral implications of this, and any kind of suggestions or ways to incorporate this in our lives today.
Yeah, absolutely. When I was at St Andrews as an undergraduate, I went to church called All Saints St Andrews, breathed Father Russell Ingham. And he had this bizarre way of talking. I suddenly found out it was a posh Glasgow accent. But his vowels were strange, especially through the English ear. Victorian, that was one of his classics. The Victorians, and without fail, he would announce from the pulpit that there be an agape and an alcohol after Mass. And for about a year, I sat thinking, what is he saying? Agape and alcohol after Mass. And eventually I realized that he was saying that there would be an agape in the North Hall after Mass.
Okay.
So, I mean, what the hell is an agape? If an agape is a means by which, as Christians, we strengthen our bonds of fellowship with each other, then there's nothing wrong with that. But why do you want to call it an agape? Why do you want to take a first century Greek title for something that is happening now? Can't you just call it, for instance, coffee hour?
Call it what?
Coffee hour. I mean, that's what the agape
Coffee hour. Okay. Yeah. So my phone gone off. Why can't you just call it coffee hour? And so, you know, we welcome people, and that's actually, we see it's an extension of our eucharistic worship, but differently. Supper clubs. Why not have a church supper club? And there's different ways of having church supper clubs. You can actually have a proper decent meal, an enjoyable meal, go out to a hotel, and, you know, have a speaker. And, you know, from a missionary society, take up a collection. Or you could say, right, actually, we're going to, you know, do something different. We'll have a kind of like a lottery supper. Mm-hmm. You know, you draw a ticket, and some people get a good one, and some get a bad one, and we can all reflect on what that says about the economy of the present West. Sorry, the phone just distracted me. I mean, one of the wonderful things we actually started doing in my last parish in St. Peter's, and it really was post-COVID, and I think part of it was a reaction to the fact that we can finally do this. We'd actually have a bring and share, a kind of lunch after Mass. People just bring all kinds of things in. And there was always enough, and there was never a vast amount of waste, which was extraordinary, because so often, you know, you always find there's either not enough or there's too many sausage rolls. But, you know, people would, as it were, bring in for themselves, but then share that out and eat somebody else's. And if somebody was without, you know, we could make it last. And I think that one of the great things about Slough, my last parish, was the enormous cultural diversity of that place. And so, you know, we had kind of North Indian foods, and we had African foods, and we had West Indian foods, as well as English foods, and it all went onto one table. And it, you know, that was, I think, the Didascalia, you know, the church being gathered from the four corners of the earth. And I suspect that when the church is gathered from the four corners of the earth, it's going to be like St. Peter's Slough, where, you know, we have people from all four corners of the earth gathered into a single act of worship. So, yes, let's celebrate agape, but don't call it an agape. Let's find ways in which we can bring food and people together and use food as a way to bring people together. Let's be more active in collecting for food banks, more deliberate. You know, and as Christians, when we go shopping, you know, can we buy another tin of beans and donate that one? You know, if you're buying 4 tin of beans, do you think you could afford to buy 5 and then donate one of those tins of beans to the food bank? And that itself is, you know, could be what early Christians would call agape, because that was why the agape, I think, formed when the Eucharist moved to the morning. It meant that people who were dependent upon that for their one meal that day didn't miss out on the meal. And so either the church publicly, through the bishop, or the private patrons, you know, would begin to, as it were, put on something else in 2nd century Asia. I think that's a main scholarly conclusion. Let's keep that lesson, but at the same time, let's not confuse it with the Eucharist.
Right. If my argument is right, and obviously I'm completely wrong, I'm sure they're all queuing up to take a bob at me, and good luck to them. But I mean, if my argument is right, there was not a confusion between these agapic feedings and the Eucharistic meal. Let Eucharist be the Eucharist. And let us, if we consecrate our own quotidian eating in whatever way we can, we recognize that when we eat as a family or as a community in college, that we are eating, as it were, through the Spirit in the presence of Christ, then we recognize that that's what part of being a meal is. So we actually come into the, as it were, the sacramental presence of Christ, that we recognize even if it's only a small piece of bread and only a little piece of wine, it is still a meal because it's participating in Christ. So let's do it. Please, let's do it agapic things. Let's whatever works in your context. You know, the bring and shares worked very well in St. Peter's Slough. I don't think it worked in my church in Dorset. But in my church in Dorset, which is where I was before I went to Slough, on the other hand, we used to actually have these fantastic kind of dinners. And sometimes they were a bit posh, and they were great. And you know, we'd have a kind of supper speaker. And that was agapic. It wouldn't work in Slough, but it works there. It's whatever works in your cultural context.
Right. Yeah.
You know, maybe, I mean, I came across this thing in America, which I found very intriguing, of going for dessert. I guess that's familiar to you. George, it was a new one on me. But
Yeah.
you know, go for pudding, for coffee and dessert. Well, you know, is that a way to do it? You know, to incorporate that, have a coffee and dessert hour.
Yeah.
You know, in your, but whatever brings food and people together, but just let the sacrality of the Eucharist be something distinct. Because on the other hand, you know, these you know, food events can be good. They also come with their drawbacks, you know what I mean? I mean, I've been to kind of church suppers where people have rolled away drunk. Is that what you want? You know, it's not just the first century Corinthians that could drink too much. All the 4th century Africans, 5th century Africans, you know, Augustine.
Right.
You know, do you really want people rolling out of church drunk? You know, those are the, you know, there's pitfalls and there's hazards.
Yeah.
So, you know, I think we do have to protect the particular sacrality of and the distinctness of the Eucharistic action as it has developed over the centuries. Because, you know, it's thinking about, you know, history is, you know, don't turn back history. I remember my teacher at school, all those years ago, Mr. Poston, talking about how governments from time to time tried to push back history, as it were. And he said, when you go to football, you go to a turnstile. The turnstile only goes one way and you can't. And he said, they're trying to force back a turnstile.
Mm-hmm.
And if you force back a turnstile, it will, you know, you won't, or you'll break the turnstile.
Yeah.
Pushing back, oh, they did that, so we're going to reconstruct first century Christianity in 21st century New York or 21st century Barbados or 21st century England. It ain't going to happen.
Right. Well, we can certainly incorporate and adapt.
We can learn from, but you know, we can't just mimic. This Eucharist, as we have it, is the product of development.
Right.
And the development is authentic. You know, we look at Newman and, you know, the doctrine of development, and we say, well, actually, it's an authentic, real development.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, thanks so much for chatting with me today. And
we've been around. We've covered some ground.
Yeah, we have to cut it off here, but I look forward to this Apostolic Constitutions book idea that you have. Want to encourage you to pursue that.
Yes, I'm also doing I've got 2 on the go, and I'm also doing Tertullian on baptism.
Oh, good.
For Brepol, so yeah.
Yeah. Well, keep up the good work,
Maybe
And,
thinking of this year, but soon I'll be back to the translation.
very good. Well, thanks for talking with me today.
Thank you very much. Thanks for your advice.